They fined me $1,500 for my own boat. Yeah, you heard that right. The HOA marched down my driveway, taped an orange notice to my front door, and declared my lake community property. What they didn't know was that the deed sitting in my safe doesn't just cover the shoreline, it covers every inch of that shimmering 30-acre lake they've been fishing in for years. So when they tried to ticket me, harass my family, and even burn down my shed to force me out, I decided to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. Let's just say when the sheriff showed up and I handed him the property map, the HOA president's smile sank faster than her overpriced base boat. Before we dive into how I turned their fake fines into felony charges, comment where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And don't forget to hit subscribe because this is one HOA story you'll want to watch all the way to the close. I grew up on that lake. Before the HOA existed, before the cookie-cutter houses and matching mailboxes, it was just open land pine trees and the sound of water lapping against the dock my father built with his own hands. My parents bought this property back in the 1972 when the county was still a patchwork of dirt roads and barbed wire fences. My dad Henry was a carpenter with a stubborn streak, and my mom Laura taught 4th grade at the small school a few miles away. Dad always said he didn't buy land, he bought peace. The world will get louder, he'd tell me, sitting by the water at sunset, so we build where it's quiet. Our deed wasn't like most. Because of how the county had divided the original parcels decades earlier, our title included ownership of the entire lake bed and water rights. That's about 30 acres of calm, pristine water, a small paradise. I didn't realize how unusual that was until much later. To us, it was just home. For most of my childhood, we were the only house out here. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, a retired park ranger who traded fishing stories with my dad over a few beers. Everything changed when I was 12. That's when the developers came. Bulldozers growled through the woods, carving roads where deer trails used to be. Within a year, the hills across the water were covered in luxury homes, white vinyl fences, manicured lawns, and people who thought rural living meant bringing their city rules to the countryside. The sign went up soon after "Welcome to Pinecrest Estates," a deed-restricted community. At first, we didn't mind. Progress happens. But then a man in a crisp polo shirt knocked on our door one spring afternoon holding a fruit basket and a clipboard. "Good afternoon. I'm Greg from the HOA board. We're thrilled to have you as part of the neighborhood." My dad, wiping sawdust off his hands, raised an eyebrow. "We're not in your neighborhood." Greg chuckled like he didn't hear that. "Well, technically, all properties around Pinecrest are considered part of the extended community. We'd love to invite you to join the association. The benefits are tremendous. Maintenance standards, community events, shared access to the lake." That word made my dad's smile vanish. Shared access, Greg nodded eagerly. "Yes, the residents have a right to enjoy the lake as a community feature." I'll never forget the look on my dad's face. Calm, polite, but final. "Son, my wife and I own this lake, the whole thing. You're welcome to look at the records at the county office." Greg's expression flickered. "Oh well, sure, of course. But you might find your property value increases if you join. We do expect everyone to follow community standards." "We're happy as we are," Mom said, softly stepping beside Dad. Greg forced a smile. "All right, well, the offer's always open." He handed Dad a glossy pamphlet about the HOA fees, bylaws, and all, and left. We thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. A few months later, a letter arrived, neatly printed full of legal language. It informed us that our boathouse needed repainting. Our dock did not meet community safety standards, and the natural vegetation along the shoreline was unsightly and should be replaced with turf grass to maintain visual harmony. Dad read it at the kitchen table, his jaw tightening. "Visual harmony," he muttered. "They can harmonize somewhere else." He crumpled the letter and tossed it into the fireplace. That should have been enough to send a message. But Greg came back this time with 2 board members in matching polo shirts. They stood in the yard, pointing at our house, the dock, the flower beds, like surveyors on a mission. I watched from the window as Dad crossed his arms, saying little. When he came back inside, his voice was steady, but I could hear the frustration simmering underneath. "They're trying to strong-arm us into joining their little club," he said. "Told me our rustic aesthetic is lowering their property values." Mom frowned. "Can they make us change anything?" No, Dad said firmly. "We're not under their jurisdiction, but they sure acted like we were." Within weeks, more letters came. Some requests, some warnings. HOA members began strolling down our driveway like they were inspecting a public park. A few even walked right up to the dock to fish. When Dad confronted them, they smiled like they were the ones doing him a favor. "It's a community lake," one of them said. Our dues pay for neighborhood improvements. You can't just keep it private. Dad laughed a low, sharp sound that scared them more than if he'd yelled. Buddy, my parents didn't build this house, and I didn't grow up here just for you to tell me what I own. You're trespassing. That night, we put up a small sign, private property, no trespassing without permission. It didn't help much. Over the next year, we started getting random visits from county inspectors, building zoning, even animal control. Each time they'd sheepishly admit an anonymous complaint had been filed. My personal favorite was the call about dangerous wildlife. Our dangerous wildlife was a 12-year-old golden retriever named Buck, who loved belly rubs and tennis balls. Mom tried to keep peace. Maybe they just don't understand, she'd say. But Dad knew better. They understand just fine, he'd reply. They just think rules make them powerful. By the time I was 16, the tension had become routine. You could set your watch by it: Tuesday, letters Friday, inspections Sunday, fishermen. Then came the day I saw my father truly lose his temper. 2 HOA reps showed up unannounced again, this time demanding that he allow limited shared access so community families could enjoy the water. Dad invited them to the dock. They followed smug and confident. He pointed at the water. You see that post sticking out there? They nodded. That's my property line. The next one also mine. In fact, every drop between here and that far shore belongs to this family. One of them laughed. That's not how lakes work. Dad turned to him calm and deadly serious. That's exactly how this one works. You can go check with the county recorder. My father bought this land fair and square when your subdivisions were still cow pastures. The men left red-faced. Later that evening, we found a flyer in our mailbox inviting all lakefront homeowners to a new lake beautification initiative hosted by the HOA. Step 1, standardizing dock materials. Step 2, unified shoreline landscaping. Step 3, community fishing events open to residents. Dad looked at the flyer and shook his head. They're building a paper fantasy. Sooner or later, it's gonna sink. I didn't know then how right he was. The HOA wasn't just after visual harmony. They wanted control over the land, over the lake, over anyone who didn't kneel to their bylaws. But the thing about growing up surrounded by water is you learn how to stand your ground. You learn patience. You learn that when people wade in too deep, they eventually realize how cold it gets. And the HOA. They were already chest deep and didn't even know it. The harassment didn't stop, it evolved. The HOA learned to disguise their bullying as concerned community engagement. That was their favorite phrase. Every letter came wrapped in politeness, every intrusion dressed as neighborly courtesy. But underneath it, you could smell the control. I remember one spring morning when an inspector showed up claiming someone had reported unsafe electrical wiring in our boathouse. The irony, we didn't even have electricity running down there. He left red-faced muttering about clerical mix-ups. My dad just stood on the porch watching him drive off, arms folded across his chest. They think if they throw enough paper at us, we'll drown, he said. They're gonna learn we float. But behind his steady voice, I could see the toll it was taking. He was a strong man, built like the oak trees around our house, but stress chisels away at even the toughest bark. He'd sit at the kitchen table at night, glasses low on his nose, flipping through another pile of HOA letters. Sometimes he'd just sigh, fold them neatly, and file them away, like evidence in a private war. Mom tried to stay hopeful. Maybe it'll die down, she'd say. They'll get bored. But she didn't believe it any more than he did. The HOA's new president, Marlene, was the worst yet. She lived in the biggest house across the lake, the kind with triple garages, spotless windows, and a flagpole she probably saluted every morning. Her husband worked in consulting, which is HOA code for no one really knows. She had the kind of smile that could slice marble. When she first took over the HOA board, she sent us a courtesy notice. It read like a peace offering, but ended with a threat disguised as advice. We understand you are not official HOA members. However, community standards apply to all properties affecting the neighborhood aesthetic. Non-compliance may result in county-level enforcement. Dad laughed so hard he almost choked on his coffee. She doesn't even understand jurisdiction, he said, but she's going to understand boundaries soon enough. What followed wasn't just harassment, it was psychological warfare. HOA members began calling the sheriff for noise complaints during our family cookouts. Someone reported our dock as a safety hazard because it didn't have railings. The county confirmed it was perfectly legal. Another claimed we were polluting the lake with old boats that had been sitting there since before any of them even lived in the county. Then came the fishing club. It started innocently enough, a few HOA members casting lines near the property line. But soon they were treating the lake like a public park. Folding chairs appeared on our bank tackle boxes, left open soda cans floating in the shallows. When Dad confronted them, they smiled that smug suburban smile, the kind that says, "We pay dues, therefore we own the world." One of them, a stocky guy with a neon visor, sneered, "The HOA says this lake's community property now. You can't just hog it all for yourself." Dad's reply was so calm it scared me. "Son, this isn't a lake you rent by the hour. It's my property. You're trespassing. I'll give you 5 minutes to reel in your line." They didn't come back for a few days, but I could feel the storm brewing. As the years went on, the HOA's tactics grew meaner. They called the county health department about our septic system. They filed anonymous tips about unregistered structures. Once an officer came to inspect unlicensed livestock because someone reported that we were keeping dangerous animals. Turned out they meant Buck, the same old golden retriever who'd sooner fetch a stick than bite a burglar. Every letter, every call, every visit added another wrinkle to my parents' faces. Then came the day Dad clutched his chest in the middle of the kitchen. We got him to the hospital in time. The doctors called it a mild heart attack, but I could tell something deeper had cracked. Lying in that hospital bed, hooked to wires, he still worried more about our land than himself. "They want to wear us down," he said, voice weak. "But this place, it's worth every fight." I promised him I'd keep helping. He recovered slower than we hoped, but the HOA didn't give him space to breathe. A week after he came home, Marlene herself showed up. Perfect hair, perfect smile, a clipboard tucked under one arm. "We're all so sorry to hear about your health," she said sweetly. "I can't imagine the stress of maintaining such a large property. Have you thought about selling? I'm sure several of our members would make generous offers." Mom clenched her jaw. "This is our home." Marlene tilted her head, that fake sympathy dripping like honey. "Of course, but, as the community grows, pressure on non-conforming properties tends to increase. Just something to consider." I still remember the way Dad's hand tightened around his walking stick. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "you're standing on my porch talking about my property while pretending to offer condolences. I suggest you leave before I forget my manners." She did leave, but not before flashing that smug grin one more time. A year later, Dad passed away. Peacefully, they said. But peace had been a stranger to him for too long. The funeral was quiet. A few family friends, some old neighbors, and unbelievably, 2 HOA board members in black suits. They claimed they were there to pay respects. Mom just looked away. I think she knew what was coming. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived addressed to her. It began with our deepest sympathies and ended with concerns regarding property maintenance and curb appeal following Mr. Reynolds' passing. That was the day I saw my mother truly angry. She slammed the letter onto the counter, her voice shaking. 30 years we've lived here. 30 years of harassment, and they can't even let us grieve. I took the letter, crumpled it, and threw it in the trash. "I'll handle this, Mom." From that day, all communication went through me. I wrote the HOA a letter so sharp it could cut glass. "Do not contact my mother again. Do not step on our property. Any further interference will be treated as harassment and reported to the county sheriff." The next visit came, not in writing, but in person. Marlene showed up again, dressed all in pastel, pretending to be gentle. "We understand this is a difficult time," she said softly, "but the fact remains, your property's condition affects everyone's home values. Perhaps it's time to consider whether maintaining it is still feasible." My blood boiled. "Our property is fine, and none of this is your business." She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Your mother's alone now. This house is a lot of work. The HOA could help find a buyer who'd truly appreciate the space." I stepped forward, meeting her gaze. "The answer is no. And next time you show up here uninvited, I'll have the sheriff waiting." She didn't say another word, but that smirk stayed glued to her face as she walked away. Mom lasted another 18 months. The doctor said it was heart failure, but I know better. She'd lost the love of her life and spent her last year under siege from people who couldn't leave us in peace. On one of her last days, as we sat on the porch watching the sun melt over the lake, she squeezed my hand. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Anything. Don't ever let them take this place from you. This lake is your father's legacy. Yours too." I promised her, and I meant it. After her funeral, I stood at the edge of the water, the same spot where my dad used to fish every morning. The lake was perfectly still. For the first time in my life, I understood why he called it peace. But peace only lasts until someone tries to steal it. I had lost my parents. The HOA had taken enough. Now it was my turn to make them regret every letter, every threat, every fake smile. And it all started with one simple decision: I was done being polite. Grief changes you. For me, it turned into energy, the kind that doesn't let you sit still. After Mom passed, I couldn't stand the quiet. The house was too still, the lake too silent. Every ripple on the water reminded me of her voice. Every creak of the dock felt like my father's footsteps echoing back. So instead of letting that silence swallow me, I filled it with something new. I decided to start a small business, nothing fancy, just something that would keep me busy and keep the lake alive the way my parents would have wanted. I called it Lake Day Rentals. A handful of kayaks, a few canoes, 2 paddle boats, and a small shed by the dock to store the gear. I went through all the right channels: permits, insurance registration, even a business license from the county. Everything was legitimate. By early spring, I was open for business. And for a while, it was beautiful. Families would come by on weekends, kids laughing as they splashed around couples taking sunset paddles across the lake. I'd stand on the dock watching them, feeling something I hadn't in years: contentment. The sound of life returned to the water, not from HOA barbecues or noise complaints, but from people who respected the place. Word spread fast. Locals loved that it wasn't overcrowded like the public lakes. By the second month, I even started thinking about expanding, adding fishing, kayaks, maybe a few small rowboats. That's when the HOA noticed. It started one morning in early June. I walked down to the dock with a cup of coffee and stopped cold. There, taped to the door of my storage shed, was a bright orange notice that screamed, "Notice of Violation," in bold capital letters. The rest read like a bad parody of government paperwork. Unauthorized commercial activity and structures on community property. Fine $1,500. All boats and related equipment must be removed within 7 days to avoid further legal action. I laughed out loud. A long, genuine belly laugh that probably scared the ducks. Community property. This was my property, every inch of it, every plank, every fish under the water. They still didn't get it. I pulled the paper off the door and crumpled it into my pocket. I figured that would be the end of it. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. 3 days later, while I was showing a young couple how to use the paddles, a golf cart came speeding down my gravel driveway. I didn't need to guess who it was. Marlene. Same pastel cardigan, same smug smile, clipboard in hand, like she was auditioning for the Stepford Enforcers. "Excuse me," she called out loud enough to interrupt my customers. "I need to speak with you about your ongoing violations." I turned to the couple, forcing a calm smile. "Give me 1 minute, folks." They nodded, clearly uncomfortable. I walked over. "This is not a good time, Marlene. That's precisely the problem," she said, voice raised. "You're operating a commercial business on community property without HOA approval. You've been informed of this multiple times, and you've ignored it." "Community property," I repeated, still calm but starting to feel my jaw tighten. "Marlene, this isn't your community's property. It's mine. The business is fully licensed with the county, and your HOA has zero jurisdiction here." She smiled that politician's smile again, the one that pretends to listen while already planning its rebuttal. "You were warned 3 days ago," she said, waving her clipboard like a sword. "Since you've failed to comply, the fine has doubled to $3,000. Furthermore, the HOA board has voted to pursue legal action if you continue this unauthorized use of the lake." My customers were watching from the dock, wide-eyed. The woman whispered something to her husband. I felt embarrassment mixing with anger that Marlene had turned my quiet business into a spectacle. I took a slow breath. "I'm not discussing this here," I said evenly. "You're trespassing. Leave my property." "The lake is a community resource," she snapped. "Your family may own the shoreline, but the lake itself belongs to everyone." That was it, the smoking gun. They truly had no idea. I smiled. "If you say so. Now please leave before I call the sheriff." Her smirk faltered, but only for a second. She shoved the clipboard into my hands. "This isn't over." As she stomped back to her golf cart, I muttered, "You're right about that." After she left, the couple came over. "We're so sorry," the woman said softly. "We live in a neighborhood with an HOA too. Some of them let the tiniest bit of power go to their heads." I chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Yeah. HOA stands for Harass Our Area, didn't you know?" They laughed. I made a mental note to use that line again. That night, I wrote a formal letter to the HOA board addressed directly to Marlene. I stated again that my property was not part of their association, that the lake and its water rights were legally mine, and that further harassment would result in legal consequences. I deliberately didn't mention the full deed details yet. Let them keep digging their own grave. The next few weeks were noisy. The HOA's fishing club began showing up daily. It wasn't a coincidence. They'd fish right in front of my dock, blocking access for my customers. Some even brought portable speakers blasting country music at 7 amperes. Others accidentally let their lines drift into my launch zone, forcing kayakers to detour. I tried reasoning with them. "There's 30 acres of water out there," I said one morning. "Can you maybe fish anywhere else?" One of them, a burly guy in a camo vest with a rod worth more than my truck, sneered. "We've been fishing here for years. HOA says we got every right." "Yeah," I said. "Then the HOA can explain it to the sheriff." He grinned like this was entertainment. "You call the cops, we'll just tell them it's a community lake. See how that works out for you." I didn't take the bait. Instead, I started documenting everything: video footage, photos, timestamps, even a spreadsheet of incidents. My father always said, "When idiots talk, let 'em. Just make sure you write it down." Soon, the harassment escalated. One morning, my rental sign had been knocked over. A few days later, I found trash bags dumped near my shed. Then, mysteriously, 3 of my paddles disappeared, only to reappear later when an HOA member proudly said he'd found them floating on the other side. It was all so childish, it almost would have been funny if it hadn't been deliberate sabotage. And then came the online reviews. Fake Google accounts started popping up. "Lake Day Rentals is illegal, unsafe, unlicensed business. Owner is hostile to community members." Each one had the same phrasing. Each one was posted within minutes of each other, and every one of them had no profile photo. Marlene's fingerprints were all over it. I contacted the platform to report the fake reviews, but it takes time to prove something like that. Meanwhile, my small-town reputation started to take hits. Bookings slowed down. Locals began asking if I was still allowed to operate, so I doubled down. I installed security cameras on the dock, motion lights, and a second lock on the shed. I even upgraded my insurance policy because when you're surrounded by people this petty, you prepare for the worst. And still, I refused to shut down. I could feel my parents with me in spirit, especially my dad. He'd face them with quiet dignity, but I had a different weapon strategy. Let them play their games. Let them print their fake fines, call their fake inspectors gossip at their little meetings. They were still playing checkers. I was already setting up chess. Because I knew something they didn't. This wasn't community property. It wasn't even shared access. Every drop of water, every fish, every blade of grass along the shoreline, they all belonged to one name on one deed. Mine. And sooner or later, they were going to find out the hard way. The nastiness had been getting worse every week, but even in my worst imaginings, I didn't picture flames roaring up the side of my shed at 2 a.m. It was Buck, my dog, my little shadow that saved me from sleeping through it. He started barking like someone had robbed the moon, a frantic, high-pitched alarm that pulled me from the fog of sleep. I stumbled to the window and saw the orange glow licking the trees beyond the dock. My heart dropped into my stomach like a stone. I ran outside in slippers and pajamas, the cold air slapping my face awake. The shed was an inferno, the whole front wall collapsing inward in a whoosh of sparks. Smoke rolled off the water in thick, choking curtains. For a beat I couldn't breathe, just stood there watching my life, my parents' legacy burn. I called 911 with shaking hands. The neighbors thought it was fireworks until the sirens cut through the night. The fire trucks arrived like a second storm. We fought it, but pieces of my business, kayaks, paddles, life jackets, decades of small repairs, and family memories were lost in the heat. The fire inspector arrived at dawn and said 2 words that landed like blows accelerant detected. Arson. The physical loss was bad enough. The emotional punch was worse. Those boats were more than inventory. They were my tether to a life that didn't end the day my parents left. Someone had taken a match to that tether, and it felt for a while like they'd burned the dock of my last refuge. And that would have been the end for most people. Not for me. I sifted through the charred remains the next morning, soot in my hair and a smell that would not leave my jacket for weeks. The security cameras that used to point at the shed had been spray-painted black before the fire. Whoever did this had planned ahead. Whoever did this wanted me to be blind. When Marlene showed up later that morning in her pastel golf cart of benevolence, I nearly laughed at the audacity. She stood at the edge of the driveway with a cup of coffee and that polished smile, surveying the blackened ruin as if she'd stumbled upon some unfortunate bonfire at a backyard barbecue. "Such a shame about your shed," she said, voice syrupy. "I'm so sorry this happened." She tilted her head and added almost conversationally, "Perhaps you were doing something you shouldn't have been doing out here." My anger buoyed up like a tide. "Are you seriously asking if I was burning my own property?" I asked. "Someone set my stuff on fire. Someone tried to destroy my livelihood. Where's your sympathy?" She fluttered her eyelashes like a courtroom actress. "Oh, I'm not implying anything. But perhaps this is a sign that commercial activities don't belong on residential property. Maybe it's time to consider moving somewhere more suitable. I'd lost my filter. I stepped forward so close she could see the grit in my teeth. "Get off my property," I said coldly. "Now." She left flippant, but I saw the way her smile tightened as she climbed into the cart. It was the look of someone who'd been cornered and was already planning her spin. The next day there was an envelope in my mailbox, no return address, a crude ransom note-style collage of letters from magazines. "Next time your house?" Whoever sent it wanted me spooked. They wanted me to run. They picked the wrong guy. That night I slept with one eye open and a pistol in the drawer, licensed, never used. I also called the sheriff's office, and the fire marshal gave them every scrap of detail I had and filed a report. The investigators were professional and sympathetic, but I knew how these things go in small towns. If the suspects are well-liked and wear polos, evidence goes cold like a forgotten beer. Two decisions crystallized in my mind like ice, forming on a pond rebuild, and make them pay attention to the law. First, I would rebuild the shed bigger, better, and smarter. Fire-resistant materials, reinforced locks, motion lights, and a security system wired not only to my phone, but to a professional monitoring company. I rebuilt with the insurance check, and I did it with a little defiance sewn into every board. Where they burned, I built back twice as strong. Second, I would stop letting polite letters and hollow smiles be my strategy. I called the lawyer my dad used years ago, a steady sort who smelled faintly of old paper and confidence, and set up a meeting. We sat at his oak table while he reviewed the deed, the property maps, and the chain of title. The ink on the pages confirmed what Dad had taught me. By the way he hammered and cut wood, the deed clearly and unambiguously included ownership of the lake bed and water rights. Not a mere shoreline claim, not a presumption, actual legal ownership. "You're sitting on ironclad title," the lawyer said, tapping the documents like he was checking for live coals. "This will make a lot of their assumptions look pretty foolish in court." I didn't want a courtroom battle just to prove a point. I wanted the harassment to stop. But there's a difference between wanting peace and letting predators keep prowling. The lawyer advised a two-pronged course. First, send certified legal notices to every household in the HOA, clarifying the property lines and revoking any informal permission the family had assumed they had. Second, post legally enforceable no trespassing signs around the perimeter of the lake. Doing that felt ugly at first. For years, my parents had let neighbors fish from the edge, launch a kayak when visiting, or bring grandma to feed ducks. It had been a neighborly trust, but that trust had been weaponized against us. Those days of casual permission had been weaponized into a right in the HOA's head. The arson changed the terms. So we sent the certified letters. Every mailbox on the HOA streets got a package copy of the deed survey sketches, a clear statement that the lake and lake bed were private property, and a legal notice revoking any past informal permissions due to documented harassment, vandalism, and arson. The packet explained that going forward, any unauthorized access would be considered trespassing and prosecuted accordingly. Then we put up the signs. Thick weatherproof placards at the main inlets and visible from the water private lake, "No trespassing, violators will be prosecuted." I made sure the language was precise and the placement legally defensible. I photographed each sign post-installation, recording GPS coordinates and timestamps. My phone buzzed with several angry messages from HOA group chats. "How dare you? You can't do that. We've used that lake for decades," but in those messages I also heard the fear, sour note I'd been waiting for. The sheriff's department started getting calls this time from me. They asked for records. I handed over the deed, the letters, the times I'd called about trespassers, the threats, the arson report. Evidence matters in these little legal wars. You don't win on righteous anger alone. You win when your paperwork is as tight as the hull of a well-built kayak. In the weeks that followed, the community reaction was a storm. A few people were genuinely upset. Some had childhood memories on the lake and resented the sudden formalization of what used to be a free-for-all. Some started a petition. The HOA president posted thinly veiled rants on a neighborhood forum. But more important than any outrage was this: the harassment slowed. Maybe they were afraid of the sheriff showing up. Maybe they were embarrassed. Maybe they were plotting. But they gave me breathing room I hadn't had in a long time. And breathing room was all I needed to rebuild both the shed and the strategy. The fire had tried to take my livelihood and burn my peace to ash. Instead, it relit something hotter: resolve. I would rebuild with insurance money and legal teeth. I would shore up the dock and the law. They'd started a war of attrition. They'd picked the wrong shore. 2 weeks after the fire, the last of my private property, no trespassing signs went up. heavy-gauge aluminum reflective lettering bolted into cedar posts and sealed with concrete. They gleamed under the sun like a wall of silver shields around the lake. That same morning, the certified letters my lawyer sent to every HOA household started landing in mailboxes. Each envelope carried a legal explanation of the property boundaries, the full text of my lake ownership, and a copy of the 1974 deed. Every word was written in plain English, so there could be no confusion anymore. By noon, I knew the news had detonated. First came the angry phone calls, residents shouting that they'd been tricked, that I was stealing their lake, that their property values would plummet. Then the HOA's group email chain exploded. Someone leaked the entire conversation to my neighbor Thomas, who lived on the edge of the community but never joined their nonsense. He printed it and brought it over. "Thought you'd want to see this circus," he said, handing me the stack. The messages were gold. Marlene predictably led the charge. "This man is delusional. He does not own the lake. We will challenge his fraudulent claims and continue to enforce HOA rules as usual." Another member chimed in. "He's bluffing. No one can own an entire lake. That's public water." And then buried halfway down the thread came a message from a resident named Linda, a real estate attorney. "Actually, he can. If his deed includes the lake bed, he's within his rights. You should verify before making statements that could be considered defamatory." The thread went dead for 6 hours after that. By evening, I heard from Thomas again. "They're calling an emergency meeting tomorrow. Marlene's apparently losing her mind." "Good," I said. "Maybe she'll finally meet reality." The next day, I didn't attend the meeting. I wasn't invited, of course, but Thomas filled me in afterward. According to him, it was chaos. Marlene tried to open with her usual air of authority, reading from a statement about community integrity and historic lake access. But halfway through, several homeowners interrupted, demanding she show proof that the HOA actually had jurisdiction over the lake. She couldn't. Linda the lawyer stood up and read portions of my deed aloud. 30 acres. Lake bed ownership, water rights, legally binding and recorded at the county clerk's office. Thomas said the room went silent, except for Marlene's pen tapping nervously on her clipboard. That silence lasted all of a minute before the shouting began, half the room accusing Marlene of misleading them, the other half demanding legal action. Marlene promised to consult the HOA's lawyer and ended the meeting early. When Thomas told me all this, I could barely suppress my grin. "Sounds like they're starting to realize they've been swimming in someone else's pool," I said. "Yeah," Thomas replied, chuckling. And the lifeguard finally showed up. The next few weeks felt like a long simmering storm. The HOA was embarrassed, but too proud to back down. Marlene started sending out newsletters, insisting they were reviewing the legal status of the lake. Meanwhile, the fishing club doubled down on defiance. I'd catch them almost daily now, folding chairs on my shoreline, beer cans tossed in the water, and rods dangling across my dock like some kind of challenge. The first time I confronted them after sending the letters, Duke, their self-proclaimed fishing club president, stood up smirking. "Afternoon, pal. Just enjoying a little sunshine," he said, reeling in a line that was clearly cast from my bank. "You're trespassing," I told him. "You got my letter. You saw the signs." He shrugged. "HOA says your claim's bogus. Until they say otherwise, this lake's ours to use." "You sure about that?" I asked, quietly holding up my phone. The screen glowed with a red recording icon. His smile faded a little. "You threatening me?" "No," I said. "Just documenting." They left 10 minutes later when the sheriff's cruiser rolled up. Deputy Carter stepped out, nodded at me, then turned to the group. "Gentlemen, this lake is private property. You've been warned. Don't let me catch you here again." Duke grumbled something under his breath about elitist nonsense as they packed up their gear. Carter leaned over to me before leaving. "They'll push it again, but keep recording everything. We'll handle it by the book." I nodded. "I'm counting on it." A week later, Marlene fired her next volley, a letter from the HOA's lawyer threatening legal action for discriminatory denial of community amenities and violation of historical usage rights. My lawyer laughed out loud when he read it. "This is a bluff," he said. "They're claiming easement by usage, but your parents' title predates their development. Legally, they don't have a toe in the water." "Then let's call it," I said. "They want a fight. Let's give them one." He drafted our counter-response, a precise professional hammer of legalese. It cited every harassment incident, the false inspection calls, the fake violation fines, the phishing interference, the defamatory online reviews, and of course the arson. The letter ended with a clear statement. Any continued attempt to assert control over Mr. Reynolds' property, including the lake and associated shoreline, will result in immediate legal action for harassment, defamation, and attempted conversion of private property. It was mailed the next day, certified and copied to the county clerk for record. From that point, things took on a rhythm they'd provoke. I'd document the sheriff would show up. Every test they ran just made them look worse. A group of teenagers from the HOA snuck onto the lake at night to make a point by posting TikToks of themselves fishing under the stars. I called Carter, and within 20 minutes, 2 squad cars rolled in. The kids were escorted home, embarrassed, scolded, and trembling, once their parents learned the sheriff had issued trespassing warnings. Marlene tried to spin the incident as a misunderstanding. Carter corrected her publicly. "No misunderstanding," he said. "Private property posted signage documented ownership. You're lucky he's being patient." It was the first time anyone had ever told her no in front of her followers. You could practically hear her ego crack. But the biggest move came a month later. The HOA officially filed a lawsuit against me. The complaint was a masterpiece of arrogance. Defendants' unilateral restriction of access to a historically communal water feature constitutes unreasonable deprivation of neighborhood amenity. They demanded I remove the signs grant water, lake access to all residents, and pay damages for the emotional distress of being denied fishing privileges. When my lawyer called to tell me, I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my phone into the water. "They just walked into a trap," he said, grinning through the receiver. "We'll file our counterclaim first thing Monday." Our counterclaim wasn't just a defense, it was a cannon blast. It listed every documented act of harassment, every fabricated violation, every public defamation, every trespass call, and included the sheriff's reports and the arson investigation. Then it tacked on one final count: attempted conversion of private property for unlawful gain. Translation: they weren't just annoying, they were trying to steal. My lawyer also filed for a motion to dismiss their suit as frivolous and sanctionable, meaning we'd ask the judge to make them pay our legal fees for wasting the court's time. By then, I'd rebuilt my boathouse stronger than ever with steel beams, a reinforced roof, and a high-end camera system that live-streamed every corner of the property to a cloud server. My business was back in motion, my name cleared, and the local community, the real one, not the HOA bubble, rallied behind me. People rented kayaks not just for recreation, but out of solidarity. One afternoon, Thomas stopped by with 2 coffees. "You know," he said, staring across the water, "the whole neighborhood's watching you now. Half of them think you're crazy, the other half think you're a legend." I smirked. "Maybe I'm both," he laughed. "Well, I'll say this much. Marlene's days of bossing people around might be numbered." I turned to face the lake, the signs gleaming across the shore like sentinels. "Good," I said. It's about time someone reminded her that not every property comes with a puppet string. I didn't know it yet, but that lawsuit, her proudest power play, was about to expose more than she could ever imagine. Because once the discovery process began, the lake wasn't the only thing she'd lose. She was about to lose everything. The legal process crawled forward at the speed of bureaucracy, slow, deliberate, and deadly if you're on the wrong side of it. When Marlene's HOA filed that lawsuit, she thought she was making a statement. What she actually did was open a vault of secrets that had been padlocked for years. My lawyer Bill was one of those calm old bulldogs who never raised his voice but somehow still made everyone nervous. "You don't beat people like Marlene with shouting," he told me. "You beat them with documents." So we started with discovery, the legal phase, where both sides have to turn over any evidence records and communications related to the case. Bill sent the HOA a neat, polite list of requests, complete financial statements for the last 5 years, board meeting minutes and attendance logs, all email communications involving me or the lake, maintenance contracts, invoices, and vendor records, documentation of community lake usage. When the HOA's lawyer saw that list, he nearly swallowed his tongue. "These records are irrelevant," he protested in a pre-trial conference. Bill smiled like a man who'd just spotted an opening. "Then you won't mind handing them over, right?" The judge, a woman with the patience of a saint and the eyes of a hawk, ruled against them. All requested materials must be produced within 30 days. That was the beginning of their downfall. When the first boxes arrived, they were enormous banker's boxes full of papers, receipts, and emails printed out like they were afraid of technology. I spent nights at my dining table surrounded by stacks of files, yellow highlighters, and coffee rings. At first it was tedious meeting, minutes full of gossip and self-congratulations, purchase orders for flowers, repainting signs, holiday decorations. Then on a rainy Thursday evening I found it. A line buried in a board meeting summary from 3 years earlier. Discussion: apply enhanced enforcement tactics on Reynolds property until compliance or sale achieved. I stared at it for a long time. My parents were still alive then. Enhanced enforcement tactics. That wasn't a neighborhood policy, that was a harassment plan. I slid the page across to Bill the next morning. He nodded once. "That's a pattern of intent." But it got worse. Much worse. We started noticing financial irregularities. The HOA collected roughly $200 0 dues every year from residents. Their expenses never added up. Landscaping companies were billing $20 0 for a month's work that no one could remember seeing done. Consulting fees of $10 0 were paid to a company called Silvercrest Management LLC. Bill squinted at the paperwork. "You ever heard of Silvercrest?" I shook my head. "Should I have? Probably not," he said, tapping his pen on the invoice. "Because it's owned by Marlene's husband." That was just the start. Another company, Bright Sky Maintenance, was registered to the treasurer's brother-in-law. Same pattern, big checks, no services rendered. Bill's voice took on that measured excitement only lawyers get when smelling blood. "This isn't just mismanagement, this is embezzlement." We hired a forensic accountant, a quiet guy named Peter, who looked like he lived in Excel spreadsheets. 2 weeks later, he came back with a detailed report that turned the case from a property dispute into a scandal. Between 2018 and now, Peter explained, approximately $350 0 HOA funds were diverted to shell companies. There's little to no evidence of actual work performed. The money trail ends in personal accounts belonging to the HOA president and treasurer. I blinked. "You mean Marlene's been stealing from her own neighbors?" "Consistently," Peter said. "And covering it with fake maintenance invoices." It was poetic. The same woman who accused me of being illegally commercial was running her own black market HOA racket. But the emails were the nail in the coffin. In one exchange dated just a few months before the fire, Marlene wrote to Duke, the fishing club guy, and the treasurer. He's still refusing to comply. "We need to make it clear that his business isn't welcome. Escalate pressure. Make it impossible for him to continue." Another thread from Duke to Marlene followed a week later. "Don't worry, we'll take care of it. He'll be begging to sell before summer." The timing, just weeks before my shed burned down. Bill set the papers down slowly, his eyes colder than I'd ever seen them. "This is conspiracy territory," he said, "maybe even criminal." We immediately amended our counterclaim. Now, we weren't just suing for harassment and defamation, we were adding counts for fraud, racketeering, and malicious conspiracy to interfere with lawful business. Marlene had turned a civil case into her own funeral procession. The courtroom was packed on the first hearing day. HOA members filled the benches, whispering nervously. Some avoided eye contact with me altogether. Others gave small nods of sympathy. I could tell many of them had no idea what their leadership had been doing with their money. Marlene strutted in like a peacock on parade pastel suit, perfect hair lawyer in tow. She glanced at me, flashing her trademark smile, as if we were neighbors meeting at a block party. Bill didn't even look at her. He just handed the clerk our exhibits. The hearing started with the HOA's lawyer insisting that the financial records were irrelevant. The judge wasn't having it. "Counsel, your client's credibility is at issue. The court will hear it." Bill stepped up, clicking the projector remote. On the screen appeared a simple spreadsheet comparing HOA dues with actual expenditures. Then beside it, bank transfers to Silvercrest Management. Dates, amounts, signatures. The judge leaned forward. "Who authorized these payments?" Bill smiled faintly. "The plaintiff, Your Honor, Mrs. Marlene Ward, HOA president." The color drained from Marlene's face. Her lawyer objected, claiming character assassination. The judge waved it off. Objection overruled. These numbers directly reflect on motive. Bill wasn't done. "We'd also like to submit Exhibit D email correspondence between the plaintiff and other HOA officers demonstrating deliberate intent to pressure and harm the defendant's livelihood." He read one line aloud: "Escalate pressure. Make it impossible for him to continue." The room went completely still. You could hear the fluorescent lights hum. The judge turned slowly to Marlene. "Mrs. Ward, do you wish to respond to this?" Her lawyer stood up quickly. "Your Honor, given the new information, my client would like a short recess to confer." "Granted," the judge said curtly. They left for the hallway. When they came back 20 minutes later, Marlene's smile was gone. Her lawyer's collar was soaked with sweat. He cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client would like to explore settlement options." Bill didn't even flinch. "Your Honor, the defendant has no interest in a settlement. Given the criminal implications of this evidence, we intend to forward all documentation to the district attorney's office." The judge nodded. "That is appropriate. And for the record, the court finds the HOA's claims baseless and the defendant's ownership of the lake fully substantiated. The plaintiff's lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice." The gavel hit like thunder. Marlene slumped in her chair. A few HOA members gasped. The treasurer started crying quietly. The judge wasn't done. Furthermore, the financial irregularities presented today warrant formal referral to law enforcement for investigation. She looked directly at Marlene. Mrs. Ward, I strongly advise you to cooperate. When court adjourned, she practically ran out of the room. Bill turned to me, shaking my hand. Congratulations, he said, his voice calm but proud. This is more than a win, it's an exposure. I didn't smile yet. I was still absorbing it, the weight of years of harassment suddenly shifting off my shoulders like a heavy coat. But when I stepped outside into the sunlight and saw a few of her former allies whispering behind her back, I finally allowed myself a grin. The story wasn't over. Criminal investigations take time. Civil damages take months. But I'd won something far more important that day, my peace. The HOA had tried to bury me in paperwork, fines, and lies. But in the end, they dug their own grave, with every fake invoice, every email, every arrogant assumption that no one would ever check the math. And the next phase, the fallout was going to be glorious. The morning after the verdict, the air around the lake felt different. Still, the same mist rising off the surface, same pine scent drifting through the air, but the silence had changed. For the first time in years, it wasn't the silence of dread. It was peace. The local paper ran the story. Within 24 hours, HOA board faces criminal investigation following fraud allegations. They even used a photo of the courthouse steps where I stood talking to my lawyer. My phone buzzed nonstop that day, neighbors, reporters, even a few HOA members offering awkward apologies. Within a week, the dominoes started falling. The treasurer resigned, first citing personal reasons. Then 2 more board members stepped down when residents demanded a financial audit. By the end of the month, the district attorney had formally charged Marlene and the treasurer with multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, and misuse of community funds. Duke, the fishing club loudmouth, was also brought in for questioning about the arson. When the news broke, I sat on the dock that night with Buck lying beside me, staring at the water's reflection. The lake looked like liquid glass, perfect, unbothered. I remember whispering, "They tried to own you. Now they'll answer to you." But winning in court didn't mean everything suddenly got easy. The HOA was still technically operating leaderless, angry, and fractured. Residents didn't know what came next. Some wanted to dissolve it entirely, others feared losing structure, and a few diehards still believed Marlene was some kind of misunderstood visionary. That's when Thomas came knocking. He was one of the few people who'd stayed civil throughout the chaos, mid-40s, practical and allergic to drama. He showed up one afternoon wearing work gloves and a sheepish grin. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Sure," I said, setting down my wrench. "I just came from a community meeting. They, voted me in as interim HOA president while we sort this mess out." He scratched the back of his neck. "Believe me, I didn't volunteer. They needed someone who doesn't scream during meetings." I chuckled. "Sounds like you're the adult in the room." "Barely." He hesitated, then added, "Look, I wanted to come here personally to apologize for everything. For what they did to your family, for how long we all looked the other way. Most of us didn't know about the fraud or the harassment, but that's no excuse. I studied his face, no script, no fake sympathy, just sincerity. Apology accepted," I said quietly. He nodded, relieved, but he hadn't come just for that. "We wanted to ask about the lake." I raised an eyebrow. "The lake, yeah." He sighed. "A lot of residents grew up fishing here. Their kids did too. Since the ban, they've been pretty heartbroken. Now that the board's changed, we were wondering if there's any way to work out something fair, a system that respects your ownership but still lets folks enjoy it responsibly." I didn't answer right away. My first instinct was to shut it down completely. After everything they'd done, the idea of opening the lake to anyone from that neighborhood again made my stomach twist. But then I remembered something my mother used to say, "Don't let bitterness decide what peace should look like." "I'll think about it," I said. "But it has to be on my terms. Rules, fees, and zero tolerance for harassment." "Fair," Thomas said, smiling for the first time. "That's already more generosity than anyone expected." Over the next few weeks, the transformation in the community was almost surreal. The HOA, once a fortress of self-importance, collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. The remaining residents voted to dissolve it entirely and form a voluntary neighborhood association. No mandatory dues, no fines, no power to control private property. Just neighbors helping neighbors. Thomas became the first president of the new group, though he refused the title. Coordinator, he called himself. Less ego that way. He and I met several times to draft what became the Lake Access Agreement. It allowed residents to buy seasonal passes, limited, controlled, and conditional. Only those who signed the agreement and followed strict conduct rules could use the lake for fishing or recreation. A portion of the fees went toward maintenance and conservation. The rest helped fund safety equipment and cleanup initiatives. I also added a clause that became my favorite line in the whole document. Any act of vandalism, harassment, or attempted interference with private property shall result in permanent revocation of access and possible legal action. Thomas read it aloud during our meeting and grinned. That's the don't mess with the owner clause. Exactly, I said. When the new passes launched that spring, something amazing happened. Not only did people sign up, they followed the rules. The first few weekends were quiet, peaceful, and almost neighborly. Families came with coolers and kids cleaned up after themselves and treated the place with respect. It felt like the lake had finally healed one cast line at a time. Meanwhile, justice was catching up with the old guard. Marlene and the treasurer both took plea deals after the DA threatened to add racketeering charges. She ended up with 3 years in prison and a restitution order requiring her to repay the stolen funds. The treasurer got 18 months and community service. As for Duke, the self-appointed king of the fishing club, turns out one of his buddies rolled on him during questioning. He confessed that Duke had set the fire under Marlene's encouragement. Duke was convicted of arson and conspiracy and sentenced to 5 years in prison. I attended every hearing. I wanted them to see me sitting there alive, unbroken, owning the lake they'd tried to take. When the judge read the sentences, I didn't cheer or gloat. I just felt something inside finally settle. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was closure. By the following summer, Lake Day Rentals was thriving again. I'd expanded the fleet, added guided nature tours, and even partnered with local schools for environmental education programs. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same lake the HOA once tried to control was now teaching kids about respecting property and nature. The Voluntary Neighborhood Association worked with me on conservation efforts too. We organized cleanups, built birdhouses, and replanted native grasses along the shoreline. People who once viewed me as the grumpy lake guy now waved when they paddled by. Thomas and I would sometimes sit on my porch sipping coffee and shaking our heads. "Can you believe this used to be ground zero for drama?" he'd say. "Still is," I'd reply with a smirk. "Only now it's the good kind." He laughed. "You realize, right, that the new folks have no idea what went down here." "Good," I said. "Let them think it's always been this way. Peace doesn't need a backstory." 2 years later, I decided to take one last step, a permanent one. I worked with a land trust organization to create a conservation easement on the lake and the surrounding buffer zones. It legally protected the area from ever being developed or controlled by any future HOA corporation or local authority. The lake would stay, as it was natural, private, and safe for generations. When the paperwork was finalized, I felt something lift off my chest. For the first time in decades, I knew no one could ever bully, threaten, or find their way into owning what my parents built. That evening, I walked down to the dock with Buck at my side, watching the sun spill gold across the water. The reflection shimmered like a promise kept. "This one's for you, Mom." "For you too, Dad," I whispered. You were right, the world did get louder, but I learned how to keep it quiet. Looking back, the lesson isn't about winning a lawsuit or humiliating a corrupt HOA. It's about understanding that ownership isn't just what's on paper, it's the courage to defend what's rightfully yours without losing your humanity along the way. I could have stayed bitter. I could have built a fence so high no one ever saw the water again. But peace isn't built on payback. It's built on boundaries and respect. The day I stopped letting anger steer me was the day the lake stopped reflecting chaos and started reflecting calm. If you're watching this, and you've ever been bullied by a neighbor, an HOA, or anyone who thinks authority equals ownership, remember the law might be slow, but truth has a way of surfacing just like the lake after a storm. So tell me in the comments, have you ever had to stand your ground against unfair rules or power-hungry neighbors? And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because next week, we've got another HOA tale that'll make you thankful your mailbox doesn't say notice of violation.